It's good to have our group back here for learning some Talmud together. Before we dive in, just want to relocate us with where we are. We are back in the Talmud, the longest written work in the ancient world, written from about the year 0 or so through the year 7 or 800 when it finally is ultimately redacted. So, the Talmud, as I've taught before, is comprised of two things. It's law, it's legal material, it's halakha, which is that word for Jewish law, and stories, legends, mystical pieces, the wisdom literature of our ancient Rabbanim and sages of antiquity. So, today we're going to look at a piece that brings up the rabbinic, I'll say, challenge that comes with the fact that the Talmud is legal, and it is stories and myths and narrative in that way. We're going to be looking at a piece today that dwells in that complication. Here, we've got more of these too. Do you all need a couple more? So, today we're going to look at Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, we have 3 stories here of his. I want us to get started in our usual method of chavruta, of turning to the person next to you and taking a first pass at it, with the understanding, with the assumption that it's going to be weird, it's going to be tricky, it's going to be challenging, and that's okay. This is all part of what this text is about, and then we're going to come back together and unpack this a little bit. So if you want to turn to the person next to you and read this aloud together. Again, because we are emulating a traditional Beit Midrash, a rabbinic study hall, feel free to be loud. Dive into it. So, ready, get set, go. Just the first text up through that bar in the middle of the page, up to that first line. All right, so it sounds like people have gotten a chance to unpack this story a little bit. I'm going to read through it. I appreciate a couple of you who caught little typos of mine in putting together these source sheets with my own translation, so thank you for your work in helping to refine Torah as always. So I'm just going to read through this, sort of take it sentence by sentence, and when folks have questions or something they want to jump in with, I invite you to let me know, raise a hand, jump in, what have you. So, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai received the tradition from Hillel and Shammai. He used to say, if you have learned much law, Hillel and Shammai were 2 of the early rabbinic houses. They were 2 of the earliest rabbis that we have. So even so, at the very, very beginning of Talmud, and they argued with each other. Generally speaking, Hillel, the tradition goes with what Hillel suggests and wants and recommends. But they are sort of the classic model of these 2 dueling schools. Yeah.
And we are to, Jill and I talked about this. Are we to assume that the tradition is our tradition?
Yes. Tradition, I could have even capitalized it there. You could say the tradition, this whole enterprise. The idea here being that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was sort of in on the ground floor of all of this. This is what we're meant to understand from that. Yes?
Well, you said then he was a synthesizer if he received the tradition from both houses.
That's a great comment. That's a very interesting piece to uplift. I hadn't thought about that before. I think this piece often gets read as Yochanan ben Zakkai was part of the project. He's part of transmitting this tradition. He's part of this whole oral set of arguments that were unfolding and taking place between all of these sages for these centuries, that he was really in the midst of it and he was in on the ground floor. But I like that interpretation that maybe if he was incorporating from both of them, he was a synthesizer of sorts. That's a great direction. Yeah, Bert.
This is chapter 2.
Of Pirkei Avot.
Right.
Yes.
Chapter 1, which to me kind of puts us in context, traces down the lineage that the tradition, supposedly, the question that the rabbis faced was, what is the authority of this?
Yes.
And they posited that it came from Sinai. And so Pirkei Avot, the chapter before this, actually begins with all of the rabbis and it all being passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation. So this is within that context.
Yes.
So it's not just one person saying tradition.
Right.
It's part of this whole long line which legitimizes, I guess, the veracity of it.
The enterprise. Thank you, Bert.
Since it came from Sinai and came from God directly, and not their opinion.
This is what Bert is giving is the way in which the rabbis derive their authority to make laws about Judaism and the way in which the place from which this whole enterprise derives its authority. Pirkei Avot is often translated as ethics of the fathers or chapters of the fathers or some such. It is a piece of Mishnah, which, to return to what is Talmud, Talmud is two written works. The first one is the Mishnah, which was written and sealed by the year 220, and the second one is the Gemara. The Gemara continues in Aramaic. It's a series of arguments unpacking what Mishnah meant. And it's a little bit vague as to when the Gemara was actually closed or redacted, but a lot of scholarship thinks somewhere 600, 700, 800 CE was when this whole thing gets closed. And so those two works together, the Mishnah and the Gemara, are what make up the Talmud. So, Pirkei Avot here is a piece of the Mishnah, so it's an early piece, and Bert is absolutely correct. In chapter 1, you get all of this piece about delineating the generations that come down. So they're laying the groundwork from which they derive legitimacy in their legislative process. So, back to sentence number 2. You see the tradition from Hillel and Shammai. He used to say, if you have learned much law, don't take credit for yourself, for it is why you were created. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples. Yes?
Sorry.
No worries.
Huh?
Yeah. Thank you.
That was confusing.
This piece about if you have learned much law.
Absolutely.
So I would tack that onto this whole legitimizing process. That it's all about, don't take credit for yourself, that you're really part of this project. You're part of this bigger enterprise. Again, thinking about the context in which this happens, they're laying the groundwork, the foundation for what will be Judaism as we have it, and we know it, and we understand it. This is the beginning of rabbis as a phenomena, as something within Judaism. So this is a lot about here we see him essentially putting down one of the rules of the debate, or the rules of the process, perhaps. That if you've learned a whole lot of law, so halacha, so about, in the legal stuff here, don't take credit for yourself. It's why you're here. You're part of a bigger purpose with that.
You're caught in the wheel.
Exactly.
Well, I get that, but the last phrase for it is why you were created,
Yeah.
That's the part that to me is odd. I find that odd. I mean, it's almost like going in reverse time and saying, well, you as a Jew were created so that you could fulfill Judaism or something.
It's a cyclical, temporal mess. I want to return to one of the sort of classic rabbinic ideas that they sit with, this idea of ein mukdam u'me'achar b'Torah. There is no such thing as early or late in the Torah. The rabbis latch onto that particular phrase from Torah, and it says a lot about their worldview. They don't view time in the way that we do. Theirs is not a temporal project. They sort of view themselves and their enterprise as somehow existing beyond time. If you look at the Talmud, you'll see rabbis arguing with other rabbis who could not have possibly lived at the same time. And yet there it is. They sort of view their enterprise as all being present with no beginning or no end, that it's sort of a cyclical, ongoing project in that way. So in that piece about what is, how is it then justifying it retroactively? Well, I just want to remind us all that their conception of time is very different than something that we would hold. Yeah.
I also had the thought that a lot of times, especially in older cultures, there was the concept of whatever you did with your life, you were born to do that.
There is that too.
If a musician was born to be a musician, a scholar was born to be a scholar. So these rabbis were created to fulfill the role of having the law passed on to them and arguing the law.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter that they ended up becoming rabbis because they would have been rabbis no matter what. That's what they were born to be.
It says a lot about their perspective and their mindset in that way. It speaks volumes to their imagination in that way. Yeah.
I think the thing about time is very, very interesting because in our culture, if a piece of research or something is, more than 25 years old, you tend to disregard it. It's not current, it's not the latest. But this is different. This credits wisdom from any time. And I like that.
I think it's it stands in remarkable contrast to a lot of the ways in which we think about time, Last time we talked about Rabbi Akiva and Messianism and this idea of an end times and a Messiah and whatnot. Much of the rabbinic project is almost antithetical to that conception of time as having an end point like that, of us arriving at some kind of end point. They see this as a ongoing, cyclical, flowing thing. Bert, did you have
I wanted to comment on it is why you were created.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it gets to a very, very critical Jewish idea, and that is that we as individuals and as a people are not here by accident.
Thank you.
That we are not random, just a random collection, and that whatever you want to call it, that there is a purpose in life. Because I remember back in the 60s. You don't remember back then?
I'm afraid I
don't. No. There's a big thing. What is life all about? Why am I here? What's the purpose of it all? I think people are still asking themselves that. Well, whether one accepts this particular formulation, to me it is part of, as you say, the product of Judaism, whether it be this or v'ahavta or l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, or we're here to love other, whatever it is, that Judaism and the Jewish tradition is a way where we find meaning in life, which the Jewish idea, it's not something you just slap onto life, but it actually comes as the foundation of why am I here?
Thank you. Beautifully spoken.
If there's any reason.
Beautifully spoken.
But Judaism assumes there's a reason.
It does. In that way, that little line actually says a lot about the perspective of the rabbis, where it is that they come from, what it is that they hold in terms of their understanding of what's the fabric of their lives and the universe as they understand it. It says a lot there, actually. Yeah.
Was at that point in history, was there kind of the concept of determinism for like religious determinism, where everything, because of God's omnipotence and everything has to occur because there is no other way for it to occur?
So that's...
Because I know that was even in Judaism that was heavily present by the 900s and on, but I don't know if that was, because that was sort of a Greek philosophy.
Without getting too deeply into it, I will say that you get very interesting glimmers of that thinking, of that thought, in the context of the destruction of the Second Temple and the kind of apocalyptic literature that all these different religious groups were producing that time. The Essenes, who were a Jewish sort of, they were I guess pre-Jewish almost, back at this time when you had the Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and Sicarii, all these different Jewish groups. Early Christians is another one, talking about the year 0 or so. They had all of these epic works about the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Again, it's this quasi-messianic, apocalyptic kind of thing, and the Christians had Book of Revelations. There were a lot of different religious responses to the kind of destruction and upheaval going on, and a lot of the theological responses do go in that kind of direction. It's a little different, though, than what comes up in the 900s or so. I don't want to go too deeply into all of that right now, but yes, in a word. Okay. Moving us along. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples: Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrkanos, Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, Rabbi Yossi the Kohen, Rabbi Shimon ben Nathaniel, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. He used to recount their praise. Rabbi Eliezer is a cemented cistern that doesn't lose a drop. Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, happy is his mother. Rabbi Yossi is a pious man. Rabbi Shimon is a fearer of sin. And Rabbi Elazar ben Arach is spring flowing with ever-flowing strength. That formulation, this ever-flowing strength there, was a challenging thing for me to translate from the Hebrew. The Hebrew, for those who speak it, is Ma'ayan Mitgaber. Ma'ayan is a spring. It's also a common Israeli name. Mitgaber comes from Gever, Gibor, this word for strength, heroism. That particular grammatical construct of it, mitgaber, is the reflexive. So it's something that continually strengthens itself, is what the Hebrew implication of it is. It's a very interesting formulation that they have there. Questions? Yeah.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
So when he was recounting the praises of the rabbis, it seems like he talked about the rabbis' characters, except for Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah.
He was a mother's boy?
He was a mother's boy.
I'm just making it interesting.
You're not wrong.
I'm not wrong.
Yeah,
Observation.
absolutely.
I think it sort of sidles around talking about his character. I mean, there's somebody who's good to his parents and who makes his mother proud. He's a good person, but I guess maybe a little boring.
That's what we think.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting that he did that rather than said, he was such a good boy and he made his mother happy. Or like,
Nice Jewish boy. Yeah, well, as we're going to see, those other three sort of fade into the background next to Rabbi Elazar ben Arach and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos. Their praise is certainly nice, but it's not noteworthy in the same way. So, he used to say, if all the sages of Israel were in one side of a balance and Eliezer ben Hyrcanos on the other scale, he would outweigh them all. Abba Shaul said in his name that if all the sages of Israel were on one scale of a balance, and also Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos with them, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach were on the other side of the scale, he would outweigh them all.
Who's Abba Shaul?
Abba Shaul comes a little bit later, and he's saying in the name of Yochanan ben Zakkai. So he's a little bit more recent, and he's saying, okay, so the text first says that Yochanan ben Zakkai says that ben Hyrcanos outweighs them all. Abba Shaul comes down later and says, no. What Yochanan ben Zakkai was really saying was that Elazar ben Arach outweighs them all. So he's almost coming and contradicting what this guy said in the first place after he is gone. Responses, yeah.
So my thought on this is that this is sort of, so we saw this in one of the earlier portions we worked on, is that it's showing already a tension between the thoughts of Eliezer ben Hyrcanos and the rest of the collected sages.
Yes.
I mean, the fact that you're making this comparison of him outweighing all of the other sages is showing that maybe, the sages are set in one way of thinking and it's not necessarily right. Eliezer is more open to that alternative thought style. But then to throw Elazar ben Arach in again at an opposition to this, saying that if these two parties that are opposed are working together, then this third party is even more heavily weighted. But, and this is a question I don't know about, wouldn't ben Arach be included in the sages to whom Eliezer ben Hyrcanos is opposed in the first example? So
Bob,
whichever one of them is opposed to the majority is the one who carries the most weight?
Excellent question. Bob, you had an interesting comment on this section too, if you want to share.
It defies the law of physics because if you put Hyrcanos on one side and everybody on the other side, Hyrcanos outweighs him. But if you put Ben Arach on one side and everybody else, including Ben Hyrcanos, on the other side, Ben Arach outweighs them. So you cannot, from a physics standpoint, balance the scales that way.
Sounds like the Israeli government politics.
Which basically means they are arguing with each other.
That's right.
As to which sage would be, in effect, the weightiest.
I would suggest that Bob is correct, that what we are seeing here are not complementary readings, but are competing ones.
Well, I was going to bounce off what you said about the translation on Elazar ben Arach. So the first one basically says the heaviest, the most significant, is it kaved that they use?
Here, let me look. Go ahead, while you're...
Okay, so the heaviest and the most significant, right, is the rabbi who is a cemented cistern that doesn't lose a drop. So what is that? Things go in, they stay in, nothing changes, and nothing leaves. And it just collects.
Right.
Okay? So that's one vision, if you want, of rabbinic perfection. Coming off your translation, if I understood you properly, Elazar ben Arach, the spring flowing with ever-flowing strength, is something that is evolving, something that is growing. You said it was reflexive, something that's moving.
Yes.
It's strength, but it's not static.
That's right.
And it becomes something over time. So those two things seem to me to kind of be opposites. I don't know if that's even a reasonable reading.
Very insightful.
So
I was bouncing off. The English, it's not clear, but bouncing off of your thing of the Hebrew.
The Hebrew is not entirely clear either, I'll give as a hint, as it often is. It's part of what makes this text very dense and challenging.
Is this an early Reconstructionist text?
Does it use the same word for weight in all the places that we've used weight, like where it says outweigh them all? Is that kavod in the last one? Is it the same word and the same root as?
It doesn't explicitly use a weight word. It just says that they're more than the others. So it talks about them being in a scale, and it says the one side is more than the other.
Well, but it also, all of the rabbis I described, with one exception.
They're all described?
My thought.
They're all described.
They're all described.
With one exception.
Are you talking about Yochanan ben Zakkai or Abba Shaul?
Well,
No, they're all five.
Yeah, but
we know
Zakkai
that Eliezer is a cistern, Ben Hananiah is his mother, Yossi, Shimon. How is Hyrkonos described? Other than the weighting of the scale.
So he is described here as...
He's
Eliezer is Ben.
Yes, he is the cistern.
He's the cistern.
That doesn't lose the drop.
Yeah.
That's right.
1, 2, 3.
They're all
So that's, they've shortened it for that.
Yeah. I could have put that in brackets there. They did that in the text, just sort of shorthand in that place. Jill had something she wanted to jump in, and then Robert too. Okay. Robert.
Just sort of following up on a comment that Bert was making, it's interesting that the two rabbis of interest, the descriptions both pertain to water.
Thank you.
And one in a not a very complimentary way, at least from Reconstructionist point of view, not very complimentary, a closed water. And the other guy is just, pure flowing, everlasting, will definitely fill up a cistern and overflow it with water.
Save that water comment. In the third story we look at, that's going to come back in a really pertinent way. But you're right to seize on that. As we're going to see, it's interesting the relationship that Rabbi Elazar ben Arach has with water.
Well, the other comment I was about to make about water, I don't know if it's relevant here, is that in that era, a couple of liquids were really very special, water and blood. And, water was a big deal, not only because they were in a desert, but it was purification was one of the purifying agents.
And I'll add one more liquid to your tally, oil. The word Mashiach, Messiah, literally just means anointed. And that's how one becomes Messiah, is one is anointed with oil. It's how they would anoint kings and the like. Oil was very much a currency at the time. So to have these containers of liquid in that way, it's instructive. Wine was too, actually, and we'll see this whole liquid piece come back again. Abraham, did you have a...
Well, I was just thinking that when you're saying that the Torah said they were, or the section said they were more than the others, is it almost the force of their dissidence, of their arguing with the rest of them, is what gave them that authority and made them more. And that perhaps that, that by stepping outside of the majority or the totality of the rest of the sages, that they wouldn't have a reason to do this if there was not such a strength in their argument or their dissidence that it created this moreness that the rabbis have.
Absolutely, that great point. That it's not just what it is they know or have, but it's even the way in which they argue with one another.
Yeah.
Their interaction that makes them great. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just say it.
Jump in.
So, we keep talking about him or him.
Yes.
Or could it just be a metaphor for what strength is? Like, not the person, but their character. Like, a cemented cistern, we were discussing, could also collect knowledge. And knowledge is strength. Or however that strength is, it's collected.
Absolutely.
You keep building and building, and you don't lose anything. And as we talked about, how you said it was continually strengthening itself.
Yeah.
So like you can learn something, but you don't have to be so rigid that you can't evolve and learn more. As opposed to this rabbi or this rabbi, it's the way you strengthen yourself.
Very nice.
Better.
So I would
say it's the characteristics, not the human being.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's possible to see both of these contenders as very important because the one who is cement and holds things securely is like the historical truth and the facts and the exactness of remembering how everything happened. But the one who is the spring is one who is developing ideas and so on. And both of these, the facts, the history is important, and also getting a creative take on things like the spring. That's important too. So I don't think we have to choose.
But as
Absolutely.
you said, they're not necessarily contemporary.
Right.
So this is on a scale.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just, Jory, just to add to the characteristics, I think there's also, you might say, a tortoise and a hare approach to it all. And the cistern is maybe a little bit boring, but very solid and strong and immovable in a certain kind of a way. And the thing about a spring is there's a real aesthetic beauty about that, and there's maybe you could say it almost like a flashiness. And it also makes me think of solidity and versus agility. And you need solidity to be agile. And which grows out of which,
I think those are both of those two comments I think are right on, and they're very perceptive. I will also say that the rabbis are not playing that game. They want to set these two characteristics up in competition with one another. Theirs seems to be the question of what do they value in their rabbinic enterprise? Is it this ability to contain, to transmit, to hold, back up to the very, very first sentence, received the tradition. You use the word, talk about facts and history and whatever. I might use the word tradition in that place. In what way do you receive and preserve the tradition as it's handed down from all of these rabbis who have been working on it? Or do you value generativity, that kind of creativity, a different perspective and approach to the whole thing? So the rabbis, their big question is, which do they value more highly? And we don't get an answer here. We get two different perspectives. One says that the ability to capture and maintain and hold the tradition, every last drop of it, all of that knowledge, as you were saying, that's what the most important thing is. And then we have the other rabbi saying, no, actually, the ever-flowing spring, the generativity, that's what's the most important. There's no consensus here, though. Yeah, Bert.
And that exists. That polarity and discussion exists to this day. What I was going to say is, again, for some context, the form of this, saying this rabbi is this and this rabbi is this, is one that is repeated in this section of the Pirkei Avot. This is one of a whole bunch of different paragraphs that have this type of thing where there are questions. Rabbi this says that, Rabbi this says that, Rabbi this says that, and then this one says, but this is the rabbi who is the most important.
Yep.
So the form here is one that is common to this whole section of Pirkei Avot.
It is. I would also posit that it's interesting to wonder, is Pirkei Avot saying that Elazar ben Arach is the more weighty of the two, that the Ma'ayan Mitgaber, the ever-flowing spring, is what's to be valued more highly because it's the last word? Or is it simply lining up two sides of the argument? The Mishnah doesn't specify. Yeah.
So I have one, should be a straightforward question and possibly a follow-up. When it says Abba Shaul said in his name, is that his referring to Yohanan ben Zakkai?
Yes.
Okay, so then the follow-up question is, where does he get off on saying that Ben Zakkai misspoke the first time and what he really meant to say was his other thing?
A great question.
Ben Zakkai was pretty clear in what he was saying.
You're absolutely right, and they do this all the time. This is also another common piece where the rabbis will argue with each other, contradict one another, say, oh, but he actually said this other thing. No, that's not the case. Further complicating and compounding the mess is the fact that, we've spoken about this before, there are two Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud, and there's the Jerusalem Talmud. So this written work that was going on over all of these centuries was happening in two places. Babylonia, contemporary, actually modern-day Iraq, and in Yavne and Jerusalem and other points in and around the land of Israel. And these scholars were going back and forth from one to the other, and they were arguing and debating with one another. But because this was an oral tradition they were having, and it was a little bit amorphous, and they would disagree with each other, and they have different versions of it in both places, there's a lot of vagueness and a lot of contradictory. It's messy.
So that first line about Eliezer could have been secondhand. Someone said that this is what he said, and then what Abba Shaul is saying is that no, what he really said was this. So he's not trying to contradict Ben Zakkai. He's trying to contradict the reporting of what Ben Zakkai had said. Or
either way,
or is that temporalness all of a sudden getting in the way again? And maybe, who knows, because these guys weren't alive at the same time.
I would say take your pick of those, but what I would suggest is that Abba Shaul sees Ben Zakkai, this earlier generation, as being authoritative in talking about this. So whether he disagrees with him or he thinks that somebody else misreported it, or whatever the reason, he's evoking the name of this sage to make his argument about the spring versus the cistern. Do we have any others? I want to keep moving because we've got plenty of stuff to read. So, one more. Go ahead.
But the reality is that we need both of them. This is the ego of two rabbis that is fighting each other. They use somebody else as their arms. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that we need the tradition and we need innovation. I
would say you're absolutely correct. They're just not playing that game. I think that what you put forth is real wisdom about the nature of what it means to be in tradition and to also be in peoplehood and be part of the innovation of it. While I also want to let the rabbis have their floor. Let them have their fight over this. And they're not going to play that game. I agree with you, but they're just not going there. They want to say that no, they would say, I imagine if they were sitting here, they'd say, no, we're having a debate about the nature of what we value in terms of knowledge and understanding and what is a true chacham, what is a true sage. Is it the container, the vessel, or is it the generator in that way? So this is what we got with Bob's piece about the physics of this becoming impossible, is that they're intentionally trying to set this up as a conflict. They don't want to have a nice synthesis of it, even though I think the truth is probably somewhere like what you're speaking. So, I want us to move into part 2 now, the second story. Let me warn you right off the bat, this is weird. What you're going to see here is something called Ma'aseh Merkavah. This is the very, very first, I would say, glimmers of Jewish mysticism. It is not a work that we have anymore, that we have written down. We don't know about what it says or what it was, but we understand that it was some kind of treatise or oral tradition or written work or something that when one could properly expound on the Ma'aseh Merkavah, the work of the chariot, remarkable things would happen. So we're looking at almost proto-mysticism in this next story here.
Before Kabbalah.
Yes. Kabbalah, so this what we're looking at is, like the 200-300s or so. Kabbalah we get starting, so that's the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who he sort of expanded upon the Kabbalistic system, but early Sephirotic Kabbalah comes about in the 1200s or so. So yes, there is all kinds of literature about the chariot, as one particular vessel. There is also the Hechalot literature, the literature of the palaces. And they would talk about these mystical journeys where they would ascend into these different layers of palaces. It was part of the mystical experience. But the chariot is part of that same genre. You're right to point that out. But it does predate Kabbalah by maybe even 1,000 years. So, think of this in terms of proto-mysticism.
So the work of the chariot, again?
Ma'aseh Merkavah.
Right.
Is this early?
We don't know what it was.
We haven't found a copy of it or anything, but we have it attested to in several places in Talmud. So, this is one of these attestations. Again, this is going to be bizarre. Read this as proto-mysticism. And go. So are we ready to come back into this piece, you think? We'll come back to it. It's a strange piece. So if it was confusing, have no fear. This is all part of the journey. I will read, and again, jump in and stop me as you will. Our rabbis taught, once Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was riding on a donkey when going on a journey, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach was driving the donkey. Rabbi Elazar said to him, "Master, teach me a chapter from the work of the chariot." He replied, "Have I not taught you thus? Not the work of the chariot in the presence of one, unless he is a sage and understands his own knowledge?" Rabbi Elazar replied to him, "Well, Master, permit me to say something which you have taught me." Rabbi Yochanan replied, "Speak," and dismounted from his donkey, wrapped his robes, and sat down on a stone beneath the olive tree. Rabbi Elazar said to him, "Why did you get down from the donkey?" He replied, "Is it proper that while you're expounding from the work of the chariot and the divine presence is with us and the ministering angels accompanying us, I should be riding on the donkey?"
Wait a minute.
Yes.
But I thought he was going to be the one expounding on the work, not the other guy.
He asks him, so he says, "Master, will you teach me a chapter of this?"
Right.
And Yochanan says no. So then Elazar says, "Well, let me just say something to you." And then Yochanan it seems like he says, okay, well, whatever's about to come out of his mouth is actually going to be this thing which I tried not to let him say. So, since I'm going to guess it's going to be this work of the chariot, I'm going to go ahead and assume the position for the work of the chariot, to be on the ground, to be grounded, to be prepared for this transcendent experience. That seems to be what's going on here.
But in the paragraph above, they talk about Ben Arach being the more weighty of.
So Ben Arach was the student of Yochanan ben Zakkai. Yochanan ben Zakkai is the one who's describing all of them in the previous piece. He's the teacher. Yeah, so just to remember, so he's the one riding, and his student, Yochanan ben Zakkai, is the master, and his student, Elazar, is coming beside him and says, "Look, will you teach me a chapter of the Ma'aseh Merkavah, the work of the chariot?" And he says, "No, you're not supposed to do it in a company of just one, unless you're a sage and you understand your own knowledge and all of this." And so then...
I didn't read it as he didn't say no. He says no unless.
Exactly.
And so the student says, "Well, okay,
Yep.
I am.
I'm up for that."
What's interesting is he asked him to teach a chapter, but then he says, "Let me tell you something."
Yeah.
So there's an interesting sort of interplay between the master and the student here. Other questions before we continue this? All right. Next page. Immediately, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach began his exposition of the work of the chariot. And fire came down from heaven and encompassed all the trees in the field, and they began to sing a divine song.
Who is they?
Probably the trees, although you could suggest it's something else. The pronouns in the story are vague, as we often get in Talmud. They play fast and loose with their pronouns, and so it gives you the ability to try on different readings in that way. So you're asking a great question.
I had said I didn't know what the work of the chariot was, and I didn't understand that, and we had kind of a consensus amongst three of us. And then I reread it and read it. The work of the chariot and fire came down from heaven. And what I recall, which many of us have seen, we all saw a movie called Chariots of Fire, which had nothing to do with chariots, and it was running.
Yeah.
And yet, they derived that title from something. And all of a sudden, it's reading here chariots and fire, and there's some symbolism between this. And I never did understand why that title came up for the movie, because it had nothing to do with the subject of the movie. But whoever wrote it must have had some knowledge.
So I wanted to also, I think that's a great, very interesting thing to lift up. I had never thought of that before in the context of this. That's cool. Just a piece of Hebrew I wanted to toss into the mix there for what he does with this. I said he begins his exposition on it. It says in Hebrew, hu patach, he opened the Ma'aseh Merkavah, and he drashed from it. If you've heard those two words before. So that's what's going on, is he has opened this thing and he is drashing from it, and then all of this stuff happens. This question, what is the Ma'aseh Merkavah, the work of the chariot? We don't know. We don't have that text. It's never been discovered. It's never been found. It's an excellent question. It does pop up, though, in numerous places, and we have an understanding that it is connected to these divine and transcendent experiences. That when this happens, all kinds of supernatural, transcendent, ecstatic sorts of things are about to happen. Yeah.
So, I mean, the work has, like, almost magical properties that you don't even see in Torah. I mean, they discuss Torah, which is the core element of the whole culture and the people and the law, and, you know, the closest they get to the divine is when someone starts invoking mystical powers because they feel like they're losing an argument. Mm-hmm. Here, just speaking about the work of the chariot is causing all these divine things. So in some effect, it's sort of separate, but it seems almost more powerful than law, than the Torah. That it's a side issue entirely that may have this more direct divine link.
Sort of like I said, hold the water piece for the third story, hold that for the third story too. Okay. This tension between whatever is going on here, this work of the chariot, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, and the way he expounds on it, and all of these supernatural things happening, the tension between that and law. There's a real tension going on, and that's going to sort of burst open in the third story. Yeah, Mickey.
There are many apocryphal writings that never got canonized. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was too complicated or too mystical for the time.
That's an interesting question, is could it have been like one of these biblical texts, in fact, that did not wind up being canonized, like the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, for instance, or the Book of Judith. There are a number of non-canonical sort of Israelite-era biblical type texts that are not in anyone's Bible. Could it be one of those? It's entirely possible. It could be something later, too. It could have come... I mentioned this time in which this era that produced all of this apocalyptic literature from all of the great political and social upheavals of the time, and the Roman military really crushing everything in its path. It produced all kinds of extreme theological responses and extreme literary responses. Could it be in that genre? It's possible. Yeah.
So I just want to tell you where Chariots of Fire came from.
Internet. Please.
Googling. The inspiration came one Sunday evening when the screenwriter turned on the television to the BBC's religious music series Songs of Praise, 1964, featuring the stirring hymn Jerusalem, its chorus including the words, "Bring me my chariot of fire."
Whoa. So there's some...
But I have a comment also.
So there's some...
Wait, Grant, did you have another piece on Chariots of Fire?
Yes, it was Bring the Chariots of Fire from the William Blake poem.
Yeah, the poem.
But the original phrase, Chariots of Fire, is from 2 Kings, blah, 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 in the Bible. So.
2 Kings, okay. Hang on, yeah, you had a comment as well, and then we'll come back around to this side.
After Google. So usually when fire comes down,
mm-hmm.
and it encompasses the trees were singing. Like that's so opposite.
I will say this is probably not meant to be read in a rational sort of sense. This is some kind of... Good, all the better. This is some kind of mystical, experiential, ecstatic vision that they're in the midst of together in this Maaseh Merkavah. He had 2 points over here, and then we'll come back to Abraham. Yeah.
I remember the movie.
Yes.
In which a Jewish runner is competing against all the other, I think it's Oxford or some English college, is competing. And no one thinks that he is going to win. And he runs like hell, and he wins. And that was because he was inspired to do that because of who he was. So he was riding on a chariot of fire. Wow.
Beautiful. That's a great drash. Great midrash. I love it. Yeah.
Well, a couple things. One, a chariot is a vehicle, and at that time, it was really something, I mean, it was like a race car or like a spaceship, maybe. Okay, for that time. I worked with a teacher who did some kind of Kabbalistic stuff, and so he talked a little bit about this, and his idea was that you're writing something and in your imagination, and maybe you're developing some kind of visualization, some kind of meditative technique, and that riding a vehicle of some kind is a way to transport yourself to another state of consciousness or something.
Absolutely. A lot of people who unpack this look at this as this is supposed to be a vehicle to transcend, to take you to a different kind of plane or a different kind of existence or a different relationship with the divine, into a different place with that. So you're right to emphasize the vehicular aspect of it. Yeah.
So two things. One was the trees being on fire. What that instantly reminded me of was the burning bush, which is, I mean, it's because it doesn't say that the trees burned at all. It says they were encompassed by the fire and they sang. Sort of like the bush was encompassed by this fire, didn't burn, but it was instead granted a voice.
Yeah.
The voice of the divine. And the other thing on the chariots of fire is that was just in that time period. Almost every culture in that region used that example when they were discussing the sun. Yeah. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, I mean, almost all of the major religions had the chariot of fire that represented life and time passing and wisdom. I mean, the sun gods were usually tied in with gods of knowledge or gods of life. So then the idea of this chariot of fire, this work of the fire being this vehicle of the divine, I mean, you could imagine, God traveling from location to location, assuming that God even needs to travel, but maybe an angel needs to travel. Physically in this chariot of fire, these pillars of flame coming down to the earth to engulf the trees, and then there's the angels that are answering from the fire and singing from the trees or what have you. And this chariot of fire is the vehicle they use to cross the sky.
So I'll say one other thing about chariot. My teacher, Dr. Elsie Stern, the biblicist who teaches at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, she teaches that the chariot was actually the most significant innovation in military technology for about 1,000 years. The chariot was effectively a super weapon for a long time in the ancient world. So that as symbol of power is, we should not underestimate that in the ancient imagination. Yeah, Bert.
And chariots play a very important part in the Exodus.
Yes.
Because at the Red Sea, it was the chariots of Pharaoh from which the Israelites were saved.
That's right. They were the weapons, the Pharaoh's great, glorious weapons wind up going to the deep. That's right. Yeah.
What about the Ezekiel story? Does it connect at all with, I don't know it that well, but I mean, the vision in the sky, is that a chariot or is that something else?
I'm going to sidestep that question because the Ezekiel narrative is one of the more, I'll stand by, is the most far out thing in Hebrew Bible. and sort of unpacking what it means and what it's about, and the visions and the mystical pieces, the flying winged creatures that come and go in the eye of Chashmal and all of this. I'll put it like this. It's a great question to ask, and I think that would be quite the road to go down right now. But you're thinking in the right direction. I'll put it like that. Other questions about this second feed? Yeah.
Where do the sea monsters come from?
Yeah, I know.
So the sea monster, so this is a line, thank you, Bert. This is a line from Psalms. And oftentimes sea monsters and the deep are evoked to talk about some of the great things. You hear about Leviathan. Leviathan was originally one of these too, Leviathan. That these were sort of the greatest creatures that live on the planet. So it's this idea of God being transcendent above and beyond even the greatest creatures that they could imagine.
Also, isn't this I think it's called a merism, where to make a point, they have from the smallest to the biggest, meaning everything.
Yeah.
It's like night and day when you're at home and when you're out on the road.
And it also goes from, fruitful
depths and the heavens.
Yep. The depths with the sea monsters is sort of an extreme circumstance that one probably wouldn't encounter ever in one's life in ancient Israel. Whereas I would be surprised if one did not encounter a tree with fruit on it in ancient Israelite life in that way. So taking something that's very everyday and mundane and contrasting it with something that's really extreme in that way, I think you're right to hold that up.
And you put the ellipses in the translation.
Yes.
You didn't leave any words out?
No.
There's the rest of this piece of the psalm.
There's more of a psalm,
right,
but the Talmud,
Talmud,
that's correct. The Talmud only brings that piece. Questions? Other thoughts?
But the sea monsters could have been, I'm being very literal.
Sure.
Ancient, prehistoric, those great things that we've seen, That could be a sea monster.
I mean...
And inspire awe and fear.
I also wonder if they ever found, dinosaur skeletons when they're thinking about Behemoth, the behemoth, that particular ancient thing, how was the ancient imagination informed by some of these creatures and skeletons and things? It's a fascinating question. Yeah.
Whale skeletons, it's hard to imagine if you see a whale skeleton washed up on a shore to reconcile what that skeleton looks like with what whales look like in the water.
Totally.
I mean, they look like giant dragons and beasts that would roam the earth because you can see the fingers and the toes on their skeleton I could definitely see you finding one of those being very odd if you didn't know what it was.
Absolutely. So here we have, to sort of bring this story back together, this one. So we have the master and the student, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach is somehow able to open and drash this Maaseh Merkavah, the work of the chariot, and affect this incredible, ecstatic, mystical experience. Again, this is the character who we see as the Ma'ayan Mitgaber. This is the ever-flowing spring. This is the source of generativity. That's the character that does the work of the chariot, that affects the Maaseh Merkavah. So again, now we're sort of honing in on what this Ma'ayan Mitgaber, what this ever-flowing spring is capable of. This is a character who is capable of going to fairly remarkable places in terms of his relationship with God and the divine and his status as a rabbi. So, one last story. This one is confusing.
Did you finish this story?
What's that?
We didn't finish the story.
Oh.
Yeah, one angel.
Thank you. An angel then answered from the fire and said, "This is the very work of the chariot." Thereupon Rabbi Yochanan rose and kissed him on the head and said...
Yeah, that is my question.
So again, the pronouns are vague. I would suggest that the master kissed the student on the head. That's what I think from context, but the pronouns are such that you can't answer definitively. Kissed him on the head and said, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who has given a son to Abraham our father, who knows how to speculate, investigate, and expound the work of the chariot. There are some who preach but don't act well, others who act well but do not preach well, but you preach and act well. Happy are you, Abraham Avinu, that Rabbi Elazar ben Arach is your descendant." So he ties this experience up neatly by rewarding him, by praising him, by saying, you are this wonderful descendant of Abraham. And thinking back to Abraham being the very first of our people to have a relationship with God. Abraham is the one who starts the covenant with God. The covenant begins with Abraham. And so Rabbi Yochanan is connecting Rabbi Elazar ben Arach with that foundational moment. Yeah?
Well, I just think that this section is interesting because it shows that we've already expounded on Arach's strength and knowledge, but this shows a wisdom, a temperance of that. He's not just creating more and more and more. He understands what he's creating and what has come before him, because earlier Zakkai says that to recite the work of the chariots, you have to understand your own knowledge. Mm-hmm. And because of how successful Elazar ben Arach is, it shows that he has a strong understanding of his own knowledge, mm-hmm. which is amazing, that he understands both what he doesn't know and what he knows, and is constantly still creating more, and to even expound upon the works of the chariot and create more than there was previously, while still understanding his own limitations, which seem almost endless at this point.
Keep that, again, this is a great piece to keep in mind for this third story. Sort of who he is, where he is, what he's capable of, and his self-understanding. And keeping in mind who is telling the story here is also very important too. Other thoughts about this?
What is the Hebrew that you translate as preach? That's a very... Preach to me is always been a very Christian word. I'm wondering what...
Who act well but do not preach well?
Yeah.
Doresh.
Doresh. Okay, Doresh.
Okay, it's like drosh.
Yeah.
It's expound.
We can
It's kind of teach/expound.
Yeah.
So the idea here is here's someone who isn't just about the words, but who can explain the words and also acts well.
And who lives it. That's right.
Lives it.
Yes, there are those three components. That's great. I appreciate you bringing that up. So who knows the words, who is able to drosh on those words and expand that into something, and is able to live and act on it and bring that into reality in a way. So these seem to be the essence of what Elazar ben Arach brings and what Rabbi Yochanan values so highly in him.
And the acting seems pretty much the most important.
That seems to come out of nowhere here, though. Right?
Say more.
All of a sudden, there's this whole other thing about the relationship between learning and expounding, and
mm-hmm.
also how you act and what you do in life, which
yes.
doesn't seem to be anywhere else in the story.
Something about this having opened and droshed the Maaseh Merkavah, the work of the chariot, has led Rabbi Yochanan to the conclusion that the way in which he lives, not only does he teach well, not only is he a master of the material and teaches on it and expounds on it brilliantly, but he lives it. There is something I want to return to this, that it is experiential. This is meant to be understood as a very real thing in that way. So there's something in this that I think that Rabbi Yochanan understands that this is partly acting it. That this Maaseh Merkavah is not just teaching, it's not just words, and it's not just action. It's something that's in between. So you're right to point that out. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And, this goes back to the beginning of the story, and it's probably not important, but it's like when you're a TA.
Mm-hmm.
Reb Elazar seems like the kind of guy that says, teacher, let me ask a question, and then expounds his own ideas for the next half hour. Where is the question? He didn't ask him a question. He says, let me ask you a question. Teach me a chapter from the work of the chariot. And then what he does is expounds on the work of the chariot himself. So he isn't asking to be taught. He's asking for the other guy just to listen to him expound.
I think he wants more knowledge.
Well, except he doesn't leave that open. He doesn't listen.
Well, because he was sort of chastised by his master, maybe.
The master says he won't teach, that you can only teach it to someone who knows. And so I think what Rabbi Elazar is saying, well, can I speak to you now and show you that I know?
He may have interpreted...
And he asked permission.
That's entirely possible to read it that way. Either this is some arrogant little thing he's doing, this stunt, or he sees when Rabbi Yochanan says, will you teach me something out of it? He says, only if you're in the right place. You could read that as saying, are you in the right place? You show me, you tell me, prove it to me. And so then he turns around and does this. And the fact that when he says, only in the right circumstances, and then gets off of his donkey, that may be in implicitly saying to Eleazar that I know what's coming, I know what you're about to do, and I'm going to get in the right position, in the right state for this experience, which is about to happen. Do your stuff, open fire. Yeah. So it's interesting, there seems to be this knowledge between the two. They know what's happening. So that question at the beginning, will you teach me a piece of it? Is that a question to actually learn it, or is that a question of, am I ready to do this? You can unpack that question in multiple ways. Other thoughts? All right, so we have now one last story. This is going to be a little bit convoluted. Surprise, surprise. But again, keep in mind, the piece about the water and the pieces you were talking about the tension between law and this stuff that Eleazar ben Arach does and who he is. The tensions between the cistern and the ma'ayan, the spring, the generativity. So, part 3, the stunning conclusion. All right. So, let's bring it back together. Part 3, the stunning conclusion. Rabbi Chelbo said, the wine of Prugaita and the water of Diomest cut off the 10 tribes from Israel. This is the 10 lost tribes that no longer exist at this point. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach visited that place. He was drawn to them.
Which place?
The place where this water and wine exist. Because again, the tribes no longer exist in their understanding. The tribes are gone now. And now this Rabbi Chelbo is saying that this wine and this water were what cut off those 10 lost tribes. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach visited that place. Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries.
Those 10 lost tribes, are they different from the Levites and the Kohens and all the other?
So there is a whole...
12.
Yeah.
Right.
There were 10 of the original 12.
Well, presumably they're the 10 that are in Israel, not on the other side of the Jordan.
So these are the 10 that are lost to the sands of time. There are theories that maybe Jews in India or certain Jews in Africa, Jewish communities, may have originally been one of these lost tribes. But they, somewhere in the ancient world, disappeared from what was mainstream Israelite identity.
So these are not 10 of the 12 then?
They were before they were gone. They originated as 10 of the 12.
Okay.
So, yes. Oh, you're just scratching. All right.
Two tribes were left.
Yeah, I don't know what to do.
Well, again, were they the 10 that went into Israel?
So this was post them arriving in Israel and establishing the monarchies and such. So something happened back then. We could unpack the lost tribes at some point, but this is the point that the story is bringing with those tribes is to say that, this is a piece of our narrative and our heritage that has actually been erased from our memories and our identities in our life. We don't know what happened. That's a mystery that's gone now. And Rabbi Elazar ben Arach went there. Rabbi Chelbo here is saying that the means by which these tribes cease to exist are this special water and this special wine. And Rabbi Elazar ben Arach went to go check out the water and the wine. He was drawn to them, and in consequence his learning was uprooted. When he returned home, he arose to read Torah. He was getting up for an aliyah. Back then, an aliyah would not have been separate from just saying the blessings and then somebody else reads it for you. You probably would get up and read that section of the text. He was supposed to read HaChodesh Hazel Lachem, but instead he read HaCheresh Haya Libam. I put them up there so you can see them next to one another. They're pretty close. Each word has one letter that's wrong, and they're shaped such that it's believable. Maybe. But the scholars prayed for mercy for him, and his learning returned. Thus we learned, Rabbi Nehorai said, "Be exiled to a place of Torah, and do not say it will follow you, for your companions will establish it in your possession, and do not rely solely on your own understanding." A Tana, one of these early sages, taught, His name was not Nehorai, but Nehemiah, while others state his name was Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. Why was he called a Nehorai? Because he enlightened, manhir, the eyes of the sages in halakha. Something happened to Rabbi Elazar ben Arach when he went chasing after this wine of Prugaita and the water of Diomest. He went after some kind of mystical thing that causes ruptures within Jewish continuity, and he lost his learning. Something happened to him. He got up. What's that? That was what Abraham was suggesting as well. That, do you want to share that reading?
What I was saying about the water of Diomest is that distilled liquor, when you distill the alcohol, is a very clear water-like substance. And back in the early days of distillation, it was a very poorly done process that left in tons of toxins and would often involve, they would boil what they were cooking, they would use wood, which would produce wood grain alcohols, which kill you if consumed too much. I mean, it's not a safe alcohol to drink. It damages the brain. It can damage vision. The idea of people going blind when they get drunk was because of wood alcohol that destroys the major parts of the central nervous system that the body can't process out the toxins. So there could be this water could have been heavily distilled liquor that was really impure and I mean, the stuff, hangover for days type.
They might have been making a rock.
It's a good one. So this question about these verses here is an interesting one because on one hand, they're pretty close. So maybe if you were going blind, you could miss it. But on the other hand, it is sort of a beginner's mistake. Anybody who would be fluent in Torah, this guy, again, this is the guy who recited and then expounded on the Maaseh Merkavah. He is not illiterate. So for him to miss this is very interesting. Now let me tell you about these two phrases. Chodesh hazeh lachem. This is the first mitzvah in the Torah. This is about calendaring and establishing a calendar and setting up law and rule and timing and categories of things. This is the very first formal mitzvah that we get. Ha-cheresh haya libam doesn't totally grammatically make sense in Hebrew. Something like, their hearts are deaf. The deaf were their hearts, or something like that. I have a teacher, Rachel Berkovitz from Pardes, who looks at that as actually a rhetorical question. That's not a statement. He's actually reprimanding the rabbis in reading Torah. He's talking about the entire legal process, and he's subverting it by saying, you guys are actually deaf to the real world around you. You all don't get what's going on. That reading of this is that what we're hearing here, this piece of the story, this is the rabbis trying to deal with this figure who has gone a little bit too far or transcended a little bit too much their legalistic frameworks. They're trying to figure out how to rehabilitate him. And he may actually, in this text, be reprimanding them in the midst of it. This may actually be an attack, this typo that he has here. That may not be a mistake. It could be a mistake. Perhaps he was blind from this alcohol. That's a great reading. It could be him attacking their legal system, saying, you all are too stuck in your own system, all of your ways, all of this traditional stuff. This could be him turning around and attacking the cemented cistern model of what knowledge is. That he's saying, actually, the substance of reality and the substance of God is something bigger than that. It's something more profound than that. And I want to get to what that is. He's this character who, we look at water as generativity. He is the source of water. He goes out in search of water. It's interesting that he is both the source of it and he is also in search of it. And what seems to bring him off the reservation and uproot his learning is him going after water, is him following that, looking for this strange, faraway water. But this is sort of who he is. He is the kind of character that wants to go unearth these mysteries and these realms of the universe.
But
yeah.
That can also lead to madness.
That it can. That it can. The rabbis, rightly or wrongly, they look at him as somehow he's lost it. He has lost his learning. Somewhere along the way here, he lost the tradition. He lost his learning. He lost his roots. They use the word uprooted. I don't think that's an accident. That something has been uprooted within him.
Disoriented.
Yeah. He seems to be in their esteem. Yeah.
Or there's the term the tree of life, so, I mean, if he's being uprooted from Torah, that means he's also being removed from life, from existence, in the way that the lost tribes were cut off from Israel.
Right. This could be actually not just a spiritual thing, but this could actually, they see this as an incredibly dangerous, life-threatening condition, to be uprooted in that way from one's place in life, from one's community, one's Torah, all of that. That is to destroy life as far as they can tell. So what happens to him? Well, he gets rehabilitated in this very interesting way. It kind of has, to me, in my movie version of it, we talked about having a movie version of it, like imagining in your head, what does your reading look like? What do these characters look like and sound like? This has glimmers of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest to me. They pray for mercy for him, and his learning returns, but suddenly he has a different name. And his name, he says, don't be exiled to a place of Torah and don't say it will follow you. He's saying, you know what? You go too far and the Torah may not come with you. Your companions will establish it in your possession. But all of my good rabbis all around me who are so good in law and are such good cisterns keep me grounded and keep me cemented and such. And do not rely on your own understanding. I relied on my own understanding and it was bad. It's almost like a lobotomized version of the Elazar ben Arach that we had in the previous pieces. They even rename him to the point that, why do we call him that? Well, because he illuminates so much halacha. He's become the legal master now. He doesn't do this stuff with the Maaseh Merkavah. He's not dwelling in the realm of mysticism anymore and these visions and these experiences. He's become the legal decider in that way.
I read that in the exact reverse.
Please, share.
Well, that yes, it is. Part of what he was saying is don't go off by yourself, because and don't say that the Torah will follow you, but go to a place where there are people with whom you can discuss Torah. To me, this is him saying Torah is a community event, and that the interchange with other scholars is what's really important. And it's a warning not against individual thinking, but against somebody thinking they can go to the top of the mountain with a scroll, and that's where they'll find enlightenment. But, but where they will find enlightenment, to me, this is saying, is in a room like this, where we are doing Torah together, where people are talking together in between them, as opposed to just individually.
So does that?
But I'm giving it a 21st century liberal twist to it.
I think that's a great reading. The question I would ask is, does that sound like Rabbi Nehorai, or does that sound like Elazar ben Arach?
Well, you see, Nehorai it says, because he enlightened the eyes of the sages in Halakha, because he was an enlightener.
Yes.
He had learned the lesson.
Okay.
Not that he was enlightened in Halakha.
But I see what you're saying.
At least if I'm reading this properly, he enlightened the eyes of the sages.
His process enlightened the eyes.
His process was, and then you get back to why traditionally Talmud and Torah is always studied in pairs.
That's a cool reading.
But it's a cool reading.
That is a cool reading. Yeah.
Maybe hopeful. Wishful thinking.
When I first read this, I had the exact same thoughts that Bert had. I mean, that was like exactly what my thoughts had been. But then when I listened to what you were saying, I sort of had a more pessimistic view of his statements of be exiled to a place of Torah and do not say I will follow you, for commands will establish in your presence. So my thought then was, what if what he's saying is that, when you go out to this place and you just assume the Torah will follow you, and everybody says, oh, well, that guy over there knows what it said. And eventually you reach this place and everyone realizes that they were relying on other people and not themselves, and that now nobody knows the entirety because everyone assumed somebody else had it. It's like if you're going hiking for even 3-4 days. You don't just assume that somebody else has the tent because you brought the food. You don't assume somebody else has the water filter because you brought the pump. You have to make sure that everyone has what they're supposed to have. You have to rely on yourself to check, and usually everyone brings anything. You bring everything you need and you have redundancy. But if you don't take that step, if everyone else just says, oh, he's carrying it, you end up halfway up the mountain, you realize that you left the marshmallows in the car because everybody else thought the other person had them for the s'mores. Except in this case, it's Torah. And if you leave out the marshmallows of Torah, you're not just going to end up with a bad sandwich. You're going to end up with nothing.
It's also interesting, the word exiled here in the Babylonian Talmud, which was written in exile. Can you talk a little about, it says, be exiled to a place of Torah.
Place is an interesting idea here, because is the place a spiritual... Well, here, I'll give you the exact Hebrew for it.
Because these people who were writing this obviously had been exiled.
That's right. So that was part of their experience in that way. So what it says is not makom, but it's rachameh, like it's this distance word that they're using here. It's it's more of a measurement than it is a specific place. It's talking about gone too far, essentially. It's that kind of comparative, qualitative idea of place rather than locale of place, or makom, this great, beautiful Hebrew word for place, which is also a name of God. So he has gone far, is how I might translate that colloquially.
Because at the beginning, basically, he went really far to this far, far off place, but it was the wrong place because it uprooted all his learning. So
that's right.
Kind of like the opposite.
So what's interesting here, and this is where I think that the perspective and the narration is interesting, is this to me, at least in this reading, if you're looking at him having been sort of rehabilitated in this way by the rabbis, that then this new Nehorai character then recites back to them their truths that they want to teach with this piece. Another piece that's interesting, and I want to contrast this, he doesn't get excommunicated. His learning gets uprooted, but he doesn't get cut out. We don't see what happened to Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos. You remember that whole story when he gets thrown? That doesn't happen to him here. There is another character, which we may learn at some point, named Elisha ben Abuya, who is also called the Acher, which means the other. He does get excommunicated, and he gets cursed and damned, and wow, they really do everything they can to cut him out of what it means to be part of them, of their body, of their endeavor. They don't do this to him. They don't do this to Elazar ben Arach. What he's doing is weird and far out, but they found a way to rehabilitate him, to make
for him and bring him back.
That's right.
They prayed for mercy for him.
They pray for mercy for him. They petition for him. They pray on his behalf, and they somehow bring him back to where they are. Yeah.
He responds to their pleas to not go off, to come back. He's cooperating with them. They say, do not rely solely on your own understanding. And he listens.
He's actually... So one of the readings of this, that he's the one actually saying that. Because down at the bottom we see that this Rabbi Nehorai says that, and one of the Tanas says that actually another name for Nehorai is Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. That they've renamed him, and he is now the voice of the body that had this tension with him. He is, if you were going to take a darker look at it, you could say he is parroting their party line, essentially, after this rehabilitation, whatever this was that happened. Yeah.
Well, it seems interesting to me because they go out of their way to try to bring him back into the fold. But with Eliezer, their first response when he disagrees with them about one thing is to excommunicate him. Was maybe Eliezer seen as more of a threat, and Elazar ben Arach was seen as, because he was seen as maybe more of like a paragon of knowledge, that they felt that he was more necessary to continue the tradition as opposed to Eliezer, who was too much of a threat with his pseudo-mystical powers of calling God into arguments and trees uprooting and rivers flowing backwards. I mean, we don't see in these three things, anyways, any example of Elazar doing things of that level of mysticism.
That's right. I think so. These two characters wind up setting themselves apart. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos, what he does is threaten the whole system. He threatens the rabbinic enterprise. with what he does. They have this whole system of arguing and their halachot and their back and forth and working with one another, and then they have some kind of a quasi-democratic process by which they decide, okay, here's going to be the halacha, and he's willing to throw that out the window. He is willing to challenge the very system. They're threatened by him. Elazar ben Arach, he's kind of a strange one, because as Bert was sort of alluding to, Judaism is not a monastic tradition. We don't view the highest heights of Torah learning as something that one does in solitude, in silence on a mountaintop. It's something that one does in these loud, noisy batei midrash, these study halls with everybody arguing and yelling and disagreeing about it. We see that as the paragon of where enlightenment and knowledge and learning comes about. So what he's doing is not in their model, but it doesn't quite threaten their model in the same way. Where one could perceive a threat is in this whole Ma'aseh Merkavah business. Rabbi Yochanan alludes to that. He says that it can be, you can't do this under just any circumstances. You can only go and open and recite this thing if you have the right kind of learning, and you should only do it in certain company. To do it with just one person present is a dangerous thing, it seems like. So what he's doing is pretty tense there too, but again, it's not quite threatening the entire enterprise in the same way that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos does in that story. So the way in which they respond to it, and they respond to him, is a little bit different. They sort of see him as this figure that, they see him as brilliant, first of all. They talk about him as being the Ma'ayan Mitgaber. He is this ever-flowing spring. They see him as this master of a teacher, as somebody who can explain and unpack these things, and somebody who lives it. But he goes a little bit too far. He's a little bit too far outside of his community, outside of the project, outside of his peers, outside of what's going on. But they also don't cut him out for it. They wind up reworking what he means in this, or you could argue that he had a change of heart. You could make the reading that he went all the way to the mountaintop. He went to the farthest extreme, and he decided that the way in which he'd been doing this was wrong, that he couldn't go anymore. There was not another work of the chariot to expound. There was not more water in this ever-flowing spring. He found out his own limits, and he came back and joined the legal enterprise. Or you could say that they in some way rehabilitated him into this figure that fit more nicely and neatly with their piece. Or even, I liked this piece, that it wasn't that he then came back and was this great teacher of law, but them watching what he did, convinced them, okay, maybe it's better to be a lawyer than it is to be the mystic, Maybe that's a dangerous thing to learn from that process. So there are a lot of different ways of reading him, but he's a complex figure. He sort of challenges the rabbinic paradigm, but he doesn't threaten it in the same way. He sort of pushes the dimensions and brings the rabbis to a place of examining what their enterprise is. How is it that he is different? The fact that he is pushing these boundaries brings the rabbis to a place of defining their own boundaries, defining what their project is, what it is that they're doing. Yeah, Jill.
He seems really well liked.
Yeah.
He's not excommunicated. He asks the teacher to teach him, and then the teacher doesn't teach him, but then he gives him the floor. He's given some latitude.
Yeah. He is. He seems to, from Yochanan ben Zakkai, and then all of the scholars praying for mercy for him and all of that.
Yeah.
He's not disdained.
I'm wondering if, I sort of bought the story that, he was chasing, he gave in, and they got the best of him, etc. Mm-hmm. But is there a possibility that remember, he's going to this place from which something terrible apparently happened. Something went wrong with the 10 tribes. Mm-hmm. And then he realizes his brain's all fried, and he's either purposefully or otherwise he's reading things wrong. Are these two connected? Did he realize? Was there something about the fact that this visiting the place where the water and the wine and something went wrong with Israel really struck him, and he actually changed rather than was changed by the other rabbis?
That's a good question too. What did what is the relationship between him going to that place and what happens to him internally there? Is he changed from without or from within? And then he goes back and he seems to be changed again. He undergoes another transformation within the rabbis. They pray for mercy and then he is transformed again. So we sort of see him as the Ma'ayan Mitgaber, the ever-flowing spring, and then we see him affecting the Ma'aseh Merkavah, the work of the chariots, and then in this last piece we get lots of transformations. He does not leave this set of sagas, this set of stories, the same that he entered. It's interesting to consider, A, the different points of transformation, and B, was he transforming from within or from without? Were the transformations being visited upon him, or were they revelations that he came to of his own personal volition? That's a good question. Yeah.
So the question I just thought about with the fact that he's being renamed is in the Torah. There's a few points where people are renamed. It's always incredibly significant. I mean, Avram to Abraham and Jacob to Israel. I mean, these are like not, this renaming is not a process that's undertaken lightly. But is it something that's common elsewhere, or is it really just tied in, this concept of being renamed with these major transformations of incredibly important figures?
I don't know if anyone's heard this tradition, but there is a tradition that goes way back, and I think, I'm trying to think of how far back it goes. It may go back this far, but there is a tradition that when one is deathly ill or sick, or there's something really wrong with somebody, that you would change their name. So that the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the evil eye, might be deceived and not catch that, oh, this is the same person. That's a really ancient tradition that goes back to the early Jewish relationship with demons. Yeah.
When my mother was really young, she was very sick. I forget what it was. It was rheumatic fever or whatever it was. They gave her a middle name because of that.
It's a pretty ancient tradition, actually, and it's something that even persists to this day. The reason I brought Elazar ben Arach is I think he's a great guy. He's a fascinating character, this sort of mystical seeker in this way. But I find that through him, we learn about him and we hear his story, but I find in some ways we learn more about the rabbis and the rabbinic project, what the Talmud is about, what are their borders, what are their boundaries, what are their values. We get to see all of that writ large in the story of Elazar ben Arach in a way that's really remarkable, that his quests and seeking and visions and all of the way in which he is different from them brings them to a place of talking about their own values. What is it that they're trying to do and how does it differ from his vision? And at the same time, we talked about these two competing visions earlier of the cistern versus the spring. And I said, well, we're not going there. I'm not letting you line them both up and have them together. The rabbis want to set them to be confrontational. Well, in the end, they do synthesize them. They don't throw him out in the end. They keep him. He's one of theirs, and he remains with them, and they continue learning with him. Yeah.
Well, it seems, one thing that seems to come through is that that Halakha and Torah must be community projects.
That's right.
And maybe that was one of the big differences between Reb Eliezer and Reb Elazar, was his willingness to be part of he wanted, when he came back, he wanted to be part, he said that not only did he want to be part of the community, he said that without the community there is a Torah.
That's right. Here's a commonality between Reb Eliezer ben Hyrcanos and Reb Elazar ben Arach. They both set themselves apart from the community, and some kind of reckoning has to happen. What that reckoning is very different.
Yeah.
But the way in which they separated themselves from the community and the actions they took, those are also very different, and they have different repercussions. Yeah.
I mean, Eliezer seemed to be a very arrogant individual. I mean, when his argument isn't going his way, he invokes divine powers, versus Elazar, who seems to be much more, I mean, he's very self-confident, but he's humble about his self-confidence. He believes himself to be worthy of discussing the work of the chariot in the presence of an individual, but he's not going to just start doing that. He's going to ask permission first. He's going to show his humility and his willingness to serve the community and the established order, as opposed to just saying, to heck with it, I'm right.
So their affect in relation to the rest of the community is really important too. Again, honing in on who is the community, what are their values, and how do these figures situate themselves relative to the community, and how does the community interact with them then? These are the questions to be asked about this. And so, again, I think that Rabbi Elazar ben Arach brings us into a really contemplative and interesting place in terms of understanding and unpacking the narratives, the imaginations, and the perspectives of our ancient rabbis and sages of the Talmud. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Baruch Tiyeh.